So where is Harish Bhai is there? I can't see him.
Yeah.
I'm here, Anil.
So it is 7:30 sharp. So let's begin. Okay. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Namaskar. Good evening and welcome to Brand Talks. 17 years ago, on 23rd July 2004, a film was released, and that film made the leading lady in a titular role very famous. Not because of the lady's acting prowess or the film story, but because what she said in a media interview prior to the film's release. The film was a very forgettable film by the name of Julie, and the film star is Neha Dhupia. Justifying the choice of an unconventional role that she portrayed on the screen, she famously said, in India, in our country, only two things sell, sex and Shah Rukh Khan. She is bang on. Sex and brands. Shah Rukh Khan is an example of a very successful personal brand. Sex and brands reside right between the 2 years. Brands are created in people's minds. So with this initial thoughts, I would like to now take things further. But before I do that, let me acknowledge the support of all those who have helped me conduct this session. Ashish Bhai and the entire GJC team, Ashok Meenawala, Anu, Mitesh, and not but the least, Penguin Publishers, Penguin Random House, India. So, Ashish Bhai, I now welcome you. Please begin today's session. We would like to have the welcome address from you. Ashish Pete.
Namaskar. Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Sandeep Bhai. Friends, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all for this session on brand building, especially on behalf of All India Gem and Jewelry Domestic Council. And we are always happy to associate with Anil Bhai and his brand talks, because I think as an industry, getting new information will always enrich and make the industry better prepared for futures to come. I think the subject today is really interesting for all of us in the jewelry industry, and I can see a lot of people from the jewelry industry and from consulting who have joined. I think as a brand is built in the minds of the consumer, as Sandeep ji would say, between the years. And as Alright Jack Trout says, that positioning and brand building is in the mind. So it's very essential to understand the psychology behind brand building. And the two people that we have today are masters at that. Interestingly, my career I started in Tata's, and also I was a market researcher at IMRB. And during those days, we used to have traditional methods like personal interviews and surveys to understand the customer's mindset. So we try to understand what the customer wants through these methods. But nowadays, the field of brain science has evolved so much, and it has made so rapid progress that in the last few years, it is possible for the marketers to understand the consumers and his needs to, I would say, a reasonable level of accuracy through these brain science methods. And to understand all this, I think we are happy and privileged to have two leading experts in the field of branding, Mr. Harish Bhat and Mr. Sandeep Dayal. And they are pioneers, and they have created many successful brands, and it will be great to hear from them. Mr. Harish Bhat currently is the brand custodian of Tata Sons, and he has held many roles in the Tata Group over, I think, last 34 years, if I mistake not. including being the managing director of Tata Global Beverages and chief operating officer of our industry's beloved watch and jewelry business, Titan Company. He has been writing extensively, and I think he is a columnist at Hindu Business Line and Mint also. And he is an established author and has written 4 books. His 4th book is Tata Stories, and it has just been published in June 2021. And in 2019, LinkedIn had selected him as one of their top voices in India. So we are lucky to have him today with us. And Sandeep Dayal ji is the managing director of a marketing powerhouse, Serenity Marketing Group, based out of Chicago, and which has been rated by Forbes as one of America's top management consulting firms for past 6 years in a row. That's quite an achievement. And he's an engineer from BITS Pilani and an MBA from Yale School of Management. And Mr. Dayal is a marketing visionary, we can say. And many of his articles, including those on building trust online, which is very critical now, creating digital brands, deciphering consumers' behavior bounds, have proven to be, remarkably accurate and far-sighted in predicting major marketing shifts. It's the most difficult part, but these things have been, quite successful. And he has developed a very practical and game-changing framework, I can say, for building what he calls cognitive brands. And right between years, how to use brain science to build epic brands is his first book. And both our speakers, I would say, now have launched their books in the month of June, a couple of months back. And I think having them here with us and celebrating their books is my privilege. And so I will congratulate both of them, and please accept my best wishes for your success of the book. And I would like to celebrate the launch of the books by holding firstly Harish Bhai's book. Please do get a personalized copy and enjoy reading it. And Sandeep ji's book also. Fabulous. And let us celebrate both these books by having a wonderful session today. And thank you once again, and keep enriching brand building, both of you. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, Ashish Bhai, for the lovely beginning of the session. Now, I would like to take the opportunity to first welcome Mr. Harish. Good evening and welcome, Harish Bhai.
Hi, Anil.
Yeah, in the beginning of the conversation, I would like to make a confession. Do I have your permission, sir?
Yeah, please go right ahead.
I have read all of your books.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And reading the books have brought about behavioral changes in me. To elaborate, I read your book, The Curious Marketer. There is a story called Why Marketers Should Visit Museums. Before I read that article or a story, I had never visited a museum in India or abroad. I used to go to Regal Cinema to watch a movie, but I had never been to Chhatrapati Vastu Sangrahalaya. And then I did not know that Bhau Daji Lad Museum was previously known as Victoria and Albert. After reading the book, I went to both those places and it opened a new world for me. I developed an interest in historical fiction first and then history. Now, whenever I go abroad, I always, when I make a list of places to visit, there is always a museum. And I spend at least one full day. And not only that, it has helped me in my professional career, because most of you may be aware or may not be aware. I have co-authored a book on the 5,000 years of Indian jewelry industry. And for that book, I wanted a lot of information. And where did I get the information from? From museums. So Harish Bhai, my book, I am a co-author, but it was a sellout. All copies have been sold, and the credit goes to you, sir.
Thank you. But
Okay.
to you for writing the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And second,
Beautiful. Yeah.
now talking about your novel, An Extreme Love of Coffee. When I read that novel, I ended up ordering lots of coffees, indigenous as well as exotic. Coffee from Vizag, coffee from Coorg, then Colombian brew, Arabic brew, blue Tokai. And in regular intervals, those coffee packets started landing up at my doorstep, much to the consternation of my wife. Thankfully, it stopped because I realized that the best coffee is South Indian filter coffee. And when the coffee packets stopped arriving, my wife told me, please convey my thanks to Harish Bhat. Thank God he did not write a book about anything more volatile substance than coffee. So, Harish Bhai, that is what I want to say about your books. And so now we begin the formal part of our conversation. I would like to know that Tata Group has been at the forefront of using market research techniques using neuroscience and neuromarketing. So I would like to you to run us through how you have been associated with all these activities. What is your opinion of brain science as a discipline, and what are the results which Tata Group has been able to get out of whatever initiatives have been implemented through Nielsen. So please begin, sir.
Yeah, so Anil, thank you for those kind words of inauguration and kind words of introduction as well. Delighted that you have read all my books, and who knows, I may write a book on a more volatile substance also very soon. So, but having said that, I want to start by congratulating Sandeep. I've been reading his book over the last few days, right between the years, and it's a very, very, very insightful, very well-written book. Which is relevant to everyone who aspires to be a marketer or is a marketer. So Sandeep, thank you very much for a wonderful book which we are launching today. The question you ask, Anil, before I started reading the book, I thought Sandeep's book is perhaps only about neuroscience. But when I started reading the book, I found that the book has wonderful flavors of behavioral economics flowing through it. So on both, let me mention what the some instances of the Tata Group and what we have done. On neuroscience in particular, I would say that the Tata Group has used, companies of the Tata Group have used neuroscience for fine-tuning pack designs, looking at how the eye moves from left to right, where the logo should be, where the picture should be. That's been very successful in the case of some of our brands which have used this. I know some of our food brands have used it in the past. Neuroscience has also been used to fine-tune advertising, to understand which scenes work best with consumers and which scenes don't work best with consumers, and how you can actually compress the advertisement into fewer seconds, conveying exactly the scenes which work with consumers. I know in the past Tata Motors has used it and other Tata Group companies as well. But moving to the other part of brain science, which is covered in extensive detail in Sandeep's book, which is really behavioral economics. And it's a key interest of mine. What I do want to mention is that in many ways, some of the biases, some of the system one principles that Sandeep talks about in his book have been used by many, many brands of the Tata Group. Sandeep, of course, has spoken about, vibing well with consumers, and he has himself mentioned the Tanishq example of how Tanishq understood what was important to young Indian women, what they were looking forward to, a life of independence, a life of empowerment, a life of freedom, and how Tanishq actually then used the right vibes to communicate with these women. So I think Sandeep's book talks wonderfully about that. He actually dedicates a complete page to the to the remarriage campaign of Tanishq, which happened a few years ago, and how it helped connect with young women. But apart from that, let me give you a couple of other examples. If I talk about Fast Track, I was part of the creation of Fast Track in Titan. The growth of Fast Track in Titan several years ago, when I was the chief operating officer of the watches business. And there again, I think when we said that youth are constantly restless, they want newness in everything, they want to keep moving on. We actually used "Move On" as the tagline of the brand. And you could argue that that's not a purely rational appeal, because moving on does not necessarily maximize your net present value of future earnings. But as the behavioral economics points out, there is immediate gratification, and there is also the bandwagon effect, which Sandeep has referred to in his article, in his book, where you want to be as cool as the rest of your generation. And that, I think, is the behavioral economics principle that Fast Track. We used it intuitively. I cannot say that we by then we had read up everything that Kahneman has written about or Sandeep has written about. We used it intuitively, and it worked very well in making Fast Track the largest youth brand of watches and accessories in the country. But if I take another more recently launched brand, let's take Tata Tea Gold Care, which has been launched with a company that I was part of, Tata Consumer Products. It has 5 natural ingredients. All it's tea, but it also has tulsi, adrak, brahmi, cardamom, and mullein. 5 things which are very, 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 very deeply embedded in Indian tradition. And when it offers consumers a way to boost health and immunity through these ingredients, then Indian minds tend to respond very well, because this confirms the deep beliefs that we have held over the centuries. And that's again an example of a confirmation bias, which is one of the key principles of behavioral economics. So these are a couple of examples. There are many, many more which have been used across the group. But the important point, Anil, that Sandeep makes is that if brands don't align themselves to the way the human brain works, and a lot of these biases and heuristics are based on how the human brain works, then brands will never be able to connect well with their consumers, never be able to persuade them to switch. So that's a few introductory remarks from my side. I do know that a couple of my colleagues on this call, Adrian and Kavita, are also keenly interested in behavioral economics. And it has been an area of significant focus for us within the Tata Group.
Great. So thank you for the introductory part. Now I would like to initiate a dialogue, conversation with Sandeep. Good morning, Sandeep. We are bothering you on a Sunday morning in Chicago.
It is my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we are very happy to have you with us today. And Harish Bhat has already said some good things about your book. I happen to be the first person who wrote a review of your book on Amazon. And after that, many people have written the review and you have got 5 stars. Everybody has given you a 5 star. And in the recent book review written by Ambi Parmeswaran, he has fondly mentioned that your book is a important and a noteworthy contribution to business literature. Fantastic. But what I found, that your book is like a gold mine. The more you dig, the more you gather, and the more you keep on digging deeper. So it has, and I believe in continuous learning, lifelong learning. That's my motto. And after reading your book, I went to the notes section, and I think the gold mine lies there. And I have ended up reading a few books, and I have ordered some. I will mention a few of them. One is by Neil, Hooked, which I already finished. Then there is a book by Stephen Jenko. Then Dr. David Burns, Feeling Good, and Dan Ariely. So fantastic. Thank you very much. But I also came across an equation, a behavioral model put forward by B.J. Fogg. B is equal to MAT. B is equal to behavior. M is equal to motivation. A is equal to ability. And T is the trigger. So while your book and Harish's books have triggered and motivated me to read more, to do more. Where I lack is the ability, the mental ability, how much I'm going to read and how many cups of coffee I'm going to consume. So that is one constraint. And the second interest is, of course, the financial constraint, because I am a middle class Maharashtrian Manus. My capacity to spend is rather limited. So with these words, I now ask you the first formal question. I follow Martin Lindstrom, and I think you are also a great fan, and there is a blurb written by him in your book. So Martin Lindstrom has written a wonderful book, Small Data, and in which he mentions that if you have to get into the minds of a consumer, you first have to get into their homes. So he goes into the homes of the consumer. He spends time in the kitchen, in the drawing room, in the bedroom, as well as in the bathroom. And the kind of insights that he gathers and he presents, simply awesome. So I would like to know, you and your team of Serenity marketers, how do you go about gathering insights? Please begin, sir.
Sure. And can you hear me fine?
Yes, sir.
Super. Well, thank you for all those kind words from the different presenters here and different participants here. It is indeed my pleasure and my honor to be speaking to you today about my book. So thank you for that. I should also mention, and I think I mentioned this to you somewhat before the session started, that actually, for me, I'm especially proud that this book is actually launching in India first. So this book was, of course, most of my experiences in the Western world, and the book is written quite significantly with a Western eye. But nonetheless, you will see in the book, there's a lot of Indian examples. And that is not just because, I was born in India. It is because I think in India, there's a lot of fascinating work that's being done by marketers in India. And I think in many ways, they're not behind anybody. They're leading in many different arenas, not just the Tanishq brand and the Tata Group, which was described earlier, but in many other things, what Coke has done, what Google has done. Sometimes is much more fascinating what it is that they've done in India versus here. So the book is launched already in India a month back, and in the US and the rest of the world, it won't actually launch until the end of the year. And that's okay by me. Going back to your question on what it is and how do you get inside the minds of the consumers. There are many of those things that are going on, which Harish also talked about, which is looking at consumers using neuro tools, if you will, neuroscience tools as like MRI and fMRI and EEGs and so on, to really see what parts of the brain are responding when people are exposed, for example, to different advertising or packaging. But even now, I think that is really a small part of how you really understand consumers. And you have to understand consumers through old-fashioned ways. As Martin Lindstrom said, you got to sit down and maybe go to their homes. In our cases, we do a lot of in-depth conversations with consumers when we are launching when we are helping our clients launch products. And it would not be unusual for me, for example, to personally, and I have a team, but for me personally to listen to 100 hours of recordings or 100 hours of participate actively in 100 hours of conversations with individual consumers. So if they're launching, for example, a drug and pharmaceuticals, I like to sit down with those patients one-on-one many times and really spend time talking to them. And by the time you're done, you spend 100 hours. And think about it, 100 hours means that you are spending 2.5 weeks doing nothing, day in and day out, doing nothing but just talking to people and understanding what they're going through. And that is, our minds in many ways are the most wonderful computers that are out there. And there is really no great substitute for spending that time. So it is there. And then what helps you is the richness of the research that has been done by different scientists in behavioral science. So, I would say our addition to that, my company's addition to that, is really more on the application side. But just as you pointed out, once you start going through the footnotes on my book, you find that there are hundreds of scientists out there in the world that are doing research in behavioral sciences. And it is up to us to really apply that knowledge. So when you get into these discussions with consumers, what we are doing is we are using the work of what people like Kahneman, people like Daisy and Ryan and so on, and applying those thoughts and those principles to these discussions, so that these are not random discussions. They are very structured discussions in which we know exactly what it is that we are looking for based on those behavioral sciences.
So I would request you to, I believe you have a PowerPoint presentation. So can I request you to begin with your presentation, please? Yeah, as a management consultant, we always have lots of PowerPoint presentations. So happy to share however much makes sense for this audience. I think I'll present a few slides. Maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about them, and then we can go to more slides, whatever works for everyone. But yes, I will present some of the basic principles of the book first. Let me just do this in the right way. Yes, okay. So please tell me if you can see my screen. Yes, sir, I can see. Perfect. Okay, so the book is called Right Between the Years and Using Brain Sciences to Build Epic Brands. By the way, when I refer to brain sciences here, there's no such thing as brain sciences per se, but it's a useful term to use for all of the different fields of knowledge that we've used to develop our findings, which includes psychology, it includes neuroscience, but it also includes things like social anthropology, linguistics, and so on, because so much work is being done in all of those areas. This is interesting. This is kind of a product of the modern world. So as the book is launched, there are various people on Instagram, I learned, that actually take your book and make nice pictures of it. So these pictures that you see of the book have been done by young men and women on Instagram who took the book and created all these interesting pictures as part of building their own influencer brands. So that's a completely unique and interesting phenomena that's going on in India and elsewhere in the world, where people are building their personal brands, and you can see some of that in action. We didn't really coordinate this. This was just done by people on their own. So here's the central thought that I think, Anil, that you had mentioned before, which is, why is the book called Right Between the Years? And psychologists sometimes like to point out that everything about sex happens not where you might think, but between your ears. And in this book, what we talk about is that the where and how of everything about branding too happens right between your ears. It's not on the billboards, it's not on those shopping shelves, it's not on those OLV ads that you see on YouTube and so on. It is ultimately happening between your ears, which is how is your brain really processing all of that information and what its interpretation of that information is. Some of the things that we talk about, there's always the question of what is a brand, and everybody has their own take of it. But, in our view, in my view, brand is our perception of the being of the full being of a product and its soul. And I will talk to that just a little bit more in the next slide. And it is that perception. What happens is that in your brain, when you see brands, when you see messaging from brands, what happens is that it triggers some sensations of your past memories. Because, once you start thinking about what exactly is in your brain, first you accept the premise that everything is happening in the brain. Then you ask the question that, well, what is in the brain? Well, in the brain, what you have is the vast collection. It's kind of the library of all the experiences that have happened to you in your life. And it is not just an exact recording of those experiences, but it is the learnings that you've accumulated from those experiences, and those learnings continue to evolve. So your memory of your experiences actually changes. So, what you think of in the past, how you were in the childhood, and so on, those learnings are there, but those are not exact recordings. And sometimes those memories actually get altered about how things happened and so forth. But nonetheless, all that's in your brain is your past experiences or the sensations of those. And there is a second thing that's in your brain, which is your harbored fantasies. We always have aspirations. We have fantasies about what could happen in the future. That is very much motivational for us. And so those fantasies are there. So your experiences and your fantasies. So what a brand does
de facto is to unlock those experiences or fantasies or the sensations of those. And cognitive brands, the term that I've coined here, they work really well because that is the way our brain works. So the cognitive designs are designed to work the way our brain does. And now we know a lot about how the brain works. So that is kind of the central thesis in the book, if you will. And we will touch on these points again and again. Here's a picture of a bottle of rum, Old Monk. Now I'm going to tell you something about this. I think most of you are familiar with this this particular brand. It's such a, this brand has been around for a lifetime, and it is still going strong. And it has a lot of history and what have you, not all of it good, but nonetheless, it's a big brand. It has had significance in most of our lives. I grew up in India. And in those times when I was at BITS Pilani, where Harish also went to school, or rather college, I should say, in Indian terms, we used to have all of these series of tests. So every semester there would be 2 test series that you would go through, and these were like really, really difficult test series. And I used to think that those test series were actually designed to make everybody fail, and then whoever failed the least got an A in the course. But nonetheless, after we were done with those intensive series, we used to go through just sitting around and just enjoying ourselves and giving ourselves a break. And we would take a bottle of Old Monk or one of the other rums that were there, and we throw it in a plastic bottle, put some orange juice and so on, and make this huge cocktail, and we would just have a wonderful time. Now, when I think about those times, really, when I look at this bottle, those experiences, those times that I spend with my friends in Pilani, all of those moments just kind of are encapsulated in this bottle. So as you see in this picture, you see that there is the picture of the bottle of rum. I'm just going to bring my pointer on here, and you can see also there's a shadow here, and you can think of all objects have something there, which is things that we can see and perceive. We can see some things, we can taste them and so on. Surely that is there, but our brain knows that everything has something else that we can't really perceive, that we don't see, we can't taste, and so on. It is true for people, right? I can meet you, I can know something about you, but then there's something else about you which is not observable by me. And that is your soul, so to speak, or that is the soul of the brand. And it is together with what you see and perceive and so on, but together with that shadow that our mind attaches to everything, which sort of comes to this whole thing that everything that the full being of something is what you perceive plus this whole soul behind it. And that's what this Old Monk experience for me has been. There are a lot of shifts, as we talked about, taking place in branding. And I will touch on these. Of course, I go through a lot of detail on these things in the book, but most brand choice is subconscious or low vigilance. In fact, most choice that you make in life, we like to think of ourselves as being very logical and thinking about things carefully and so on. But many times we are really just going by subconscious, we're making decisions subconsciously. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that 95% of all choices we make in life are really subconscious or low vigilance. Low vigilance just means that you give it some thought, but not a lot of thought. Thoughts, feelings, and actions don't happen in a sequence. In marketing, people have always believed that, you think about a brand and you get some emotions about that brand, and then you take the action of buying that brand. But that is really not true. Many of these things just happen in random orders. And sometimes they all happen in a single burst because we are really drawing on those memories that we have. Emotional branding is a bit of a misnomer. There's been a lot of work done around emotional branding, and people have emphasized that a lot. But in my book, I argue that it doesn't always work. By the way, you mentioned earlier that, sex and branding sells, and there's actually an argument to be made, which essentially I present in the book, which says that sometimes when you over-sex things or over-emotionalize things, people notice the emotions, people notice the sex, but they don't remember your brand. So there is a real amount of care that you have to exercise when you're doing emotional branding to ensure that your brand is still the star of the story. And then consumer intentions, people have always thought consumer intentions are short and they're getting shorter and shorter. That is actually also not true. Consumer attentions can be, attention can be short or long. It is up to the brand to really tell a good story and expand that attention span. Attention spans are very flexible, and the brand can really drive how flexible and how long or short they're going to be. So that is the thing. So what does that mean for brands? And then this is kind of the last two of the theory pages, but this is how the book is set up. We talk about brands in sort of 3 parts, which is you start at the bottom of this, which says brand vibes. This is something that says, does this brand connect with me? Does this brand give me a good vibe? Do I have a good social chemistry with this brand? Second thing is, does this brand make sense to me? And then the third thing is brand resolve, which is, will this brand make me happier? And happiness is an exact science these days. There's more research going on happiness than on any other thing in psychology. And we talk about that. I talk about that in the book. I tend to use the term we here because a lot of this work came out of the work that my company has done, which consists of a number of people. But nonetheless, these are the 3 things, and we will touch on these with examples, throughout this discussion. So let me just go to brand vibes. And the issue with brand vibes is that this is a new notion, because historically what we have talked about, or what we have believed about brands, is that if you have a product, branding is not difficult, historically speaking. Branding is what? You look at your product and you say, what's different about my product? And then you say, look, my brand is going to be something that is about communicating that difference that is unique to my product. And what we're learning now is that brands are actually doing things in very different ways. And one of the ways in which they're doing things and making connections with consumers are through empathy, through that sharing of values and what have you. And let's take a look at that, because I think there are 2 examples that I just quickly touch on. One is the Dove soap. This was kind of a breakthrough moment in marketing for me, which is 15 years or so back, maybe a little bit more than 15 years back. Dove came out with this real beauty campaign, in which what they did is that they really moved away from showcasing super thin models, almost anorexic models that used to be the kind of the standard for all advertising. You'd have these unrealistically beautiful women that would be on there. And many of those women were actually starving themselves and not eating enough to really look the way that they looked. And it sort of made what Dove realized, Unilever brand, what they realized is that, it was actually making women in general feel bad about their own bodies, because they wouldn't look anything like these models. And so what Dove did is that they realized that there was this angst, and they started putting just real women, people that were women that were a little heavier set, women that were darker in color, all kinds of different women that were real women, and put them on their boards. And the interesting thing about their billboards, was that there was no mention of the soap. So they didn't say that, look, we have this Dove soap, which is creamier, it's going to clean better, it's going to leave your skin more moisturized and so on, which were all true, but they never mentioned any of that. They didn't even mention that they were a soap. They just showed these women that were real women. And this campaign became a big hit in the United States. But not just in the United States. This is the same campaign that went actually global. And we talked to people in Brazil and many other places, and this campaign resonated everywhere. So you have to ask yourself, what is it that's changing about branding if you don't even mention your product, if you don't even mention what's different about your product, but you just connect with people and create a multi-billion-dollar impact in your brand? And I think the brand Tanishq in India has done something very similar, which is they've taken on some very interesting themes from remarriage, which Harish had mentioned at the beginning of this discussion by way of introduction, by way of being on the side of women that are working women. And the reality is that in India, and I grew up in India, so I can speak to this, that women for the longest time had a secondary place in society relative to men. And that is changing, and thankfully so. We're all happy about that. But it is the case that in many, many different, I would say, small and big ways, women did have a secondary place in society. And I think what is happening in reality is that women are actually working. They're very much a valuable part of the working community in India. And they're making great accomplishments and so on. So, they need to be recognized for their own sake, not as shadows of anybody. And I think if you look at this ad, I'm just going to play the ad, which is Mia is a brand that was introduced by Titan as a brand that is targeted at working women. Let's take a look at their ad in this case. I'm just going to play it for you.
Want a lawn that looks like this, but your lawn looks a little bit more like this? Then you should click right here and check out.
All right. right, so here it is.
To those who live in their little bubble that a girl can't juggle between the office and the home because they think it'll be such a struggle. Well, it's the last thing on my mind. And how some colleagues get a kick by shooting their mouth too quick.
Hey, I got promoted.
About how I'm getting ahead just because I'm a chick. It's the last thing on my mind. Or that question that everyone seems to have on their face about why I act like I own the place. It's
So, you know what, so there are many things that are just interesting about this ad. Let me just kind of see if I can. So one thing is that, the women that are used in this ad, you can see they are a little bit more dusky in complexion and so on. So the ad is moving away from that whole situation of sort of idealizing fair-skinned women and perfect models. The women that we see in this ad, they could be the women that are our colleagues at work, right? The women that we see every day. And so that was a big shift. The other thing that you see is how they're talking about recognizing women specifically for their success and for the accomplishments that they have, and not that, hey, they're getting ahead in the world just because they're women and so forth. So I think Tanishq in this case did a great job of sort of having this brand vibe whereby they were able to connect with working women in a very fabulous way. In these other ads, they celebrated the institution of weddings, which is quite central to the culture in India. In this one, you see two of a kind always make a beautiful pair. It's a nod to the LGBTQ community. So I think when you look at all of this stuff, you see how brands are finding these innovative ways to really tap into how our brain works and do branding in a completely different way, find a new way of forming chemistry. What I'm going to do here is stop at this point. This is one part of the three-part branding model, and maybe see if we can have Harish comment on a few of these things, since he has an inside view of some of these things.
Fantastic idea, Sandeep. So before we invite Harish, I have a small observation to make. You have rightly pointed out that what works is either nostalgia or fantasy. Most of us have grown up watching Bollywood films or advertisement commercials. And what do we find? Hero होता है, वो कितना भी बड़ा हो जाए, वो हमेशा कहता है माँ के हाथ का खाना, गाजर का हलवा, पालक पनीर, पराठा. So he's always on a nostalgic trip. And when he thinks about a girl, I will illustrate by example of a film song. एक लड़की को देखा तो ऐसा लगा जैसे खिलता गुलाब, शायर का ख्वाब. So it's either nostalgia or fantasy. So that is one observation. And second point is, at the risk of sounding like a dirty old man, I would like to initiate a discussion on sex in advertising, because Harish mentioned fast track. Now fast track became notorious because of the kind of ads they made, and it created controversy, and controversy is always good for the brand. But to be very honest, I remember that, I don't remember the content, but I remember the brand. And in one of the films, there was Virat Kohli. So with these thoughts, Harish, please.
So Sandeep and Anil, thank you. And the concept of brand vibes, Sandeep, is a very powerful concept. When you say that consumers either have strong memories, old monk, I share many of your memories since I'm from the same college as you are. It was very popular on campus, certainly after the compres and after the midterms, without doubt. That's what they were called. But the point you make about brand vibes is getting onto the same wavelength as the customer first, so that the customer knows that you're his or her kind of brand. And that's very, very important. So Anil, I think Fast Track is an excellent example of that. They continue to do that today, and in the past also. Fast Track tries to understand what young India wants, and tries to relate to young India in their own language. Of course, you have to walk a fine balance when you do that, no doubt about it. But the other example, Sandeep, I want to give you, again from the Tata Group, is a brand like Tata Tea. Now, Tata Tea has had, you spoke about, the length of a story being the kind of story you say, and consumers having long attention spans if you say good stories. So Tata Tea has been on a story platform called Jagore for the last 10-12 years. And each time they've had a new installment of that story. Initially, it was to do with, how we should not encourage corruption. Later on, it was to do with how we should encourage women to vote in elections. More recently, it was to do with how we can, help either sports or our community in the most recent campaign. So if you look at the entire Jagore campaign, it kind of understands a key concern that a citizen or a consumer has at any point in time and tries to relate to that, saying this brand shares that. And here is a good way of actually expressing that concern in a constructive way. So I believe that story has lasted and will perhaps continue to last for many more years. The other thing that I like about your brand vibes, the examples that you gave are many of these vibes, Sandeep, were discovered by these brands. If you look at Dove, before Dove did that kind of advertising, before Dove decided to celebrate real beauty and not just anorexic beauty, like you put it, no one else did that. So they discover a vibe. Tanishq discovered a vibe. When they talked about Mia and the working woman's jewelry, they discovered this vibe that you're talking. Everyday women like you and me in our offices, they discovered that vibe as to what that consumer wants. So my thought there, Sandeep, is you have to strike the right vibe, but you also need a very sharp insight to be able to get at that vibe, to be able to get at that right vibe. So it's sometimes easier said than done. And I agree with you what you said and what Martin Lindstrom says. Unless you spend enough time with consumers, you will never be able to figure out what their memories or their fantasies are.
Yes, I think those are excellent examples, and I would summarize them by saying that in the book, what I say is, as far as vibes are concerned, there are two kinds of vibes. One is when you are able to say to someone that I know how you feel, right? So when we talked about the Titan, this Tanishq example with Mia, they were able to relate to women by saying, look, people minimize your accomplishments all the time, right? By saying, hey, you got ahead because you're a woman. They're minimizing your accomplishment. And I know how you feel. That is what the Tanishq brand said, that I understand how you feel. So, and that's one way to build a vibe. The second way is by sharing in values, which is where you say that, look, I have the same values as you have. And so when you're talking about Tata Tea and Jagore, right, where you're saying that, look, this brand resonates or brings out those values around no corruption or fair elections or things like these are values. These are fundamental values that we all want to have, right? So when a brand can communicate to us that it shares the same values as its consumers, then it forms these deep ties. And there are a number of brands that are more and more brands that are starting to do these things. And what they're finding is that when you connect with consumers in that way, these binds and these bonds can become really strong. And it is not very different from how we connect with people ourselves, right? If I feel like you and I have a common chemistry, if I know that you understand how I feel, then I'm much more likely to believe everything else that you say, right? And that is why vibes are so important, because they increase the trust and the believability of what the brand is saying.
That is Sandeep, and
please.
it goes back to back to interactions between human beings. Unless two people have good vibes with each other, why will they interact with each other?
Yes, yes.
Interact with each other in an extended way, I'm saying. Transactional interactions may still happen, but
yes.
yeah.
So Sandeep and Harish, see, one dilemma which the brand builders face is the fact that either there is a sameness in all the ads, especially in jewelry industry. There's a good looking woman, there is a product, and there is a logo. So either all ads look same or they are overly emotional. So you have said in the book, Harish, Sandeep, that if the mind sees the same things, they ignore the message. Whereas if the advertisement or the message is too emotional, then people focus on the emotions and forget about the brand. So there is a question also from one of the audience members, Richa Vahi from Delhi. And she says, according to her, in India, emotionals sell. Cry and buy seems to be working. So whether if you want to address this question now or as we go along, I leave it to you. Over to you, Sandeep.
No, we can talk about it right now. So emotional branding became, a big thing. There was a guy by the name of Mark Gobi who came out with a book called Emotional Branding, which was maybe about 15 years back. And since then, there was a lot of focus on, making brands very emotional. But you have to remember that at the end of the day, you are trying to sell your brand. You're trying to sell your product, right? You're not trying to sell emotions. And you cannot assume just because somebody enjoys your ad or really like it because it has a very emotional depiction in there, that it did anything for your brand. And what we are finding is that there is research to show that if you over emotionalize things, particularly negative things, if you over emotionalize negative emotions, which is the cry kind of emotions, if you will, then people tend to focus on the emotion piece, but they forget to focus on your brand, right? So then you have lots of these ads where people can remember the story, but they can't remember what the brand was for the life of them. So what purpose does that serve, right? So that happens. Same thing has happened with studies that have been done around sex, which is that when you have sexual content in ads, people often focus on that sexual content. However, how does that relate to your brand might be lost, in which case you as a marketer then have failed if that happens. The clever thing, and I think you saw that there were two, let me make two more additional points about the Mia ad that you saw. The jewelry was kind of not front and center in that, right? But it was always there. Women were getting dressed, they were wearing their earrings, they were wearing their bracelets or so on and going to work and so on. So it was just a part of the whole theme, but it was woven in very strategically with the whole storyline. So that is kind of that is the balance that you have to strike. The second thing that I will also mention there about attention spans is that Mia ad that I played is about a 3-minute ad. Now just step back and think, who would watch a 3-minute? People are saying attention spans are getting shorter. You should be doing 15-second ads. These guys have put up an ad, which is on YouTube and, other OLV media, which is 3 minutes. And you go and look at there and you see millions of people have watched these things, right? So how are consumer attention spans getting smaller, right? So the whole thing is you've got to create the interest in the right way. And then you have to do, you have to make sure that your brand story is woven integrally with the emotional story being done. And that is the right way to do it.
Perfect. Point well taken, Sandeep. And can we move on to brand sense now?
Yes, so let's take a look at the second part of branding. Let me just share my screen again here for a second. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So the second part of this is, and a lot of you talked about Kahneman, and I think Kahneman has been a very central figure in this whole arena of behavioral economics. You might also know that he won a Nobel Prize for his work on prospect theory. The interesting thing is that he's actually a psychologist, and he won, and there's no Nobel Prize for psychology. There's a Nobel Prize for economics, and he won it for economics, even though he's really a psychologist. And but the point is that the kinds of things that he has discovered and he has described are things about how the brain works. And those things are applicable to areas of economics as well. And therefore, many of these things that we talk about are referred to as findings from behavioral economics. There really are findings in psychology and economics and various other fields. But he talks about, the question becomes, how does the brain actually work? And for the longest time, marketers thought, hey, there are functional parts of the brain, there are emotional parts of the brain, maybe there are different centers in the brain which respond to love, to friendship and anger and many of these things. But when you actually start studying the brain, you're not really finding all these different pieces that you would say, hey, where's the area for love? It doesn't quite exist. So what Kahneman actually clarified importantly for marketers is that there are just two ways in which the brain works. There is system one thinking and system two thinking. System one thinking, if you will, from a, there's a whole description about it, but from a shorthand perspective, I like to think about system one thinking as instinctive thinking. So these are things that we do, choices we make, which are gut feel based. And then there's deliberative thinking, which is where we think about things, we deliberate on them, and then we make choices. So things like 2 + 2, these types of things, that's an instinctive thing that comes to you. 17 × 24, that's a little bit more difficult, and you have to think about it and you do the calculation, and that's deliberative thinking. Now, this is not to don't mistake this as, hey, you use system one for simple things and you use system two for more complex things. That can be the case. But you can use system one for very complicated things, like, things like driving. Driving is very complicated. And we drive without having to think about it. It's just like an extension of our, instincts and our body, and we just kind of drive, or we can go on a bicycle. But when you start designing these artificial intelligence systems that are supposed to be the basis behind cars, it is very difficult for them to actually design those systems, and that is why they haven't been perfect and they haven't been in place for very long. But most humans, 99% of them can drive a car pretty easily. So that's all system one. That's all system one. System two is where you do much more, detailed deliberation, like doing equations and doing pros and cons and doing algorithms and theorems and so on. And we rarely use that. 5% of the time, this is used in choice. 95% of the time, this is what is used in choice. And don't think of this, by the way, as emotional and rational. That's a common mistake that people make. As I said, there isn't that distinction in the brain. The distinction is purely system one and system two, instinctive and deliberative, and emotions can be on either side of this equation, by the way. So what has been observed is that when you start thinking about the first part of it, which is the system one easers, this is where you do the instinctive thinking. And this is you can think of this as someone that's tapping into that learning in your brain. Like I said, in your brain, there is all that experiences and so on. So a brand that is tapping into system one is really saying that I know you have certain wisdom that you've acquired over your life, and I'm going to align myself with that wisdom that you have. Now, some people refer to some of these wisdoms and these common tendencies that we all have as biases. And I find that to be a bit of a negative word because it sort of says something is wrong. But really, I refer to these things as cognitive wisdoms. But nonetheless, there's a lot of research that's been done and lots of different types of learnings, if you will, that have been found, like loss aversion bias, anchoring bias, IKEA effect, and so on. These are things that we as a human race tend to have in common with each other. This is across many different cultures, across many different countries. These are the kinds of learnings that are already there. I'm going to give you some examples of ads that have been based on these types of things. So one that is a favorite of mine is for Guinness beer, which really talks about how we as humans have a tendency to belong to groups or belong to clubs. What does that mean? In-group bias, basically there are two things that happen as far as our interactions with groups is concerned. One is that we like to change ourselves, if you will, to make ourselves much more similar to the group, to fit in. So we increase the similarity with the group, and we increase the dissimilarity or the distance from other groups. So we like to say, this is my club, and then you kind of wear your club uniform and you do the things that everybody else does in your club. But then you try to make your club very different from somebody else's club. And that is what in-group bias means. So you have this beer, Guinness beer. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's this, black looking, very dark beer. It looks like something quite different. And, many people would argue that, is it really beer or is it something else? It's much more bitter. It looks different, and it tastes very different. So what they did is that they made that a strength of their brand. So they made that made of more. So they said, yes, we know we are completely different from any other kind of beer, but we are different because we're made of more. And what their ads did is to sort of take that idea and make it more about their consumers and say that the people that drink Guinness beer are people that are very different from they're special people. They have special values, and they are different from any other kind of beer drinkers. So watch this ad, and I'll just give you some idea of what's in the ad. You'll see people playing basketball in a wheelchair, and see what happens. Sorry, I'll just make it full screen.
Dedication. Loyalty.
Getting better at this, yeah. Next week, buddy.
Friendship. The choices we make reveal the true nature of our character.
So if you look at that ad, that's the interesting part there, which is, you see all these people playing wheelchair, and really what you find is that at the end of the day, only one person really needed that wheelchair, and all of his friends were playing in a wheelchair just to sort of level the playing field with him. And then you have to sort of ask yourself, what kind of people would do that? Well, how many people would really get into a wheelchair and play basketball with their friend just to make the playing field level? And the answer is that those are special people. Those are people that are made of more, which is what kind of the whole thing is about, what Guinness beer is. So this is a way in which Guinness has really done a superb job of bringing its brand message of made of more being a distinctive beer into heart by you tapping into what is the in-group bias, which is a system one feature. The other thing that is common is also where people say, hey, when life is complicated, why don't you simplify it? And this is based on something called the Occam's razor, where people say that, hey, when you have complex choices, the simple answer is the better answer. Now, that is really not true. But nonetheless, people do tend to believe that, generally speaking, given two choices, the choice that is simpler is the easier choice. And there are a lot of brands that make their message about things keeping things simple, like Staples, which does office products, and then another one, which this is Prepared Foods, which shows that prepared meals can be a very simple way of making your life easier. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. You can read about these on the book. I do want to cover two other examples which really relate to System 2, which deals with more the jewelry industry. So
Sandeep, can I interrupt here?
Yeah.
Harish has to leave at 8:40 because he has some other commitment. So what I would request that we invite him now. He can reflect on what you have presented so far. And we also request him to tell us a story from his book, Wearing a Brain Sensor. Is that fine?
Yes, let's do that. We can always come back to these.
Let Sandeep complete System 2 as well, and then he can invite me to speak. So that's
if you have time, sir, we don't mind, but we have
because I think
only 6 minutes.
So don't worry, I'll stay on for a little more time. Let Sandeep complete,
Okay.
because System 1 and System 2 are integral part of the brain sense idea.
Okay,
Perfect.
so let me do that. So System 2 is this whole notion of being deliberative. And one of the ways in which Patek Philippe, so for those of you who have seen this watch. It's a very expensive watch, which is sold worldwide. You know, more than $50,000, $100,000 is not out of the question. So one of the things that they did was to really make this thing, some value proposition be acceptable to consumers. Because remember, you can just get your watch you can get your time for free from your cell phone and get it very accurately. What they did is they said, look, you're not really spending $50,000. What you're really doing is you're making an investment. And that investment is really about your own tradition, about your own legacy that you're going to leave for your kids. So in that way, they said it's not an expense at all. It's just your legacy. It's your investment. And that is why they talk about this whole thing about begin your own traditions. By giving a Patek Philippe to your kids or to your wife or whoever, you're beginning your own tradition. This is something that's going to speak to you. They say you never actually own a Patek Philippe. You merely look after it for the next generation. So very clever. And this is a brand that has been there and has essentially this message for the last 50 years, which tells you of how great the branding has been. Let me also talk about De Beers, which also uses the same way. You know, De Beers made diamonds weren't particularly rare, you know, and but it was, and they in the United States, it wasn't always the case that a diamond was a mark of your engagement and so on. But they did that, you know, they made the diamond about the one moment in your life, right? And so it became that solitaire that you would get for your engagement. Then to expand the market, because they already owned 80% of the market. So how do you expand the market when you already own most of it? So well, they did the past, present, and future campaign, which was about your past, present, and future, and it required 3 diamonds. Or about eternity, this life and the next life and what have you. And so that's a ring with diamonds all around. And then finally, when you run out of the left hand, you go over to the right hand, and the right hand is about me campaign really started talking to women and saying, hey, you're being accomplished and therefore you should be able to go, and you don't need a man to buy you a ring. You can go buy your own rings. And these ads that you see here are about that, which is women of the world, raise your right hand, right? That is what this campaign was about. So I'll stop there and bring Harish into the discussion.
Yes. So, you know, both these are beautiful examples of Patek Philippe and De Beers. And there was a question asked earlier about how jewelry ads can be different and still convey emotion. So for a moment, Sandeep, I want to stay on that and say the De Beers advertising has been very emotional. They have, you know, an engagement and a marriage is one of the most emotional moments of your life. But they have done it in such a differentiated manner that De Beers stands out. You know, you cannot mistake that ad for anything else. As much as Patek Philippe, you know, it's a very highly priced watch, highly priced mechanical watch, which people are willing to invest tens of thousands of dollars and buy maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, they've actually changed the game from looking at the watch as an accessory to looking at it as an investment for several generations. So, which is also a very strong emotion that you're leaving an heirloom behind for your next generation. So I would say, Anil, the person who asked you that question, emotion can work if it's done well and if your product and brand is integrated into it well, but not always. Otherwise, sometimes the emotion may overpower the brand. There are so many advertisements you see with dance and songs that you never remember. Now, on System 1 and System 2, my point, Sandeep, would be that for an existing product, which has deep-rooted memories or deep-rooted traditions in the consumer's mind, System 1 can typically tend to work very well out of the two brand sense. So take brands of food or brands of food ingredients or spices or dals or brands like that. You know, you typically show a very happy family occasion, the entire family enjoying the meal together, maa ka banaya hua khana, maa ka haath ka khana, all that. That is deeply entrenched in the Indian psyche, that we sit together as a family and we have dinner, that the mother takes care of her family and prepares very good food for the family. So that works very well with System 1 thinking. In those pieces of communication, the brand doesn't say I have ingredient A, B, C, D, E. They just they capture that. They know that good homemade food would have those ingredients. So System 1 thinking can work very well like that. System 1 thinking can also work well for an existing product which is well known. If you use a nice device, and here I will bring up the example of another brand of the Tata Group called Voltas, which makes air conditioners. So Voltas for a long time used this wonderful device of a person called Mr. Murthy, whom you would have seen in their advertising. He does humorous stuff, but he narrates, what the brand is all about very easily. People easily pick up his cues because they're familiar with Murthy, they're familiar with Voltas. But when you move into a new product category, or you move into a category where consumer habits have changed significantly, there I would think system two thinking plays a big role. Or if it's a very high value product, like a home that you're buying, or an expensive car that you're buying, then system two thinking will play some role. It cannot be all system one. So if Voltas itself were to introduce a new IoT-enabled air conditioner, which they have launched, or a voice-enabled Alexa-enabled air conditioner, which they have launched, then you'll see that much of the launch advertising will talk about those features in greater detail. So I think as marketers, Sandeep, both work in brand sense, but we have to understand which kind of brands, when brands are at what stage of their maturity can system one work versus where can system two work. So I think I'd just like to provide that perspective of what you said.
Yeah, those are wonderful examples, Harish. So sharing those was very helpful. And that is exactly the point, which is, we know that the brain likes to use system one 95% of the time, but when you have something that's very different, very new, you have to get people to think about, evaluate those brands more deliberatively. And particularly as we've come into the internet world, there are a lot of things that have required us to change our behavior. Like, in the US, we use Uber. I think in India, you have another service, Oyo or something, which is Ola, sorry. Yeah, Ola, you have that, which is very similar to that. But it's a completely different way of taking taxis, right, from what you were used to. And so those things require behavior change, and that takes time. And that is when you have to bring in system two to trigger, to force people to think about how these things could be better.
And I'd like to add one more point there, Sandeep. It's a point for discussion. But as I read your book, one thought that struck me is that if you're launching a new brand in a new category, or a new brand in a little known or not so deeply rooted category, you probably start out with system two methods of making brand sense. But as your brand connects more and more with consumers, becomes more and more familiar to consumers, over a period of time, it's easier for marketers to gravitate to system one, which is much more, easy cues that your mind can easily pick up. That's perhaps another another thought that occurs to me as you talk about brand sense.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that thought. I think it is partially true. I think that can be one way that you go, but it doesn't always have to be that you do it in that particular sequence. Yeah. And I'll give some examples of how those things can be. I don't want to keep you long because I know you have another.
He has to tell a story first, huh?
Why don't you complete the brand choice part, the brand resolve part, and then maybe we can do a brief discussion about that as well before I leave.
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
To complete your framework very nicely, and it's a beautiful framework.
Okay, so let's go to that. I'll share my screen real quick. So the last part, as we talked about, as I mentioned before, is this whole notion of brand resolve, which is where you get consumers off the fence of indecision and get them to buy your product. So what happens is that when you talk about your brand and what have you, people will sometimes say, yeah, this, all of this makes sense to me. And, you think, yeah, everything is right. But then you don't actually take any action. And that is the part that is what is called the fence of indecision or the fence of indifference. And to get people off that fence, what do you do? So there's a lot of research, as I mentioned before, which is around the theory of happiness. And we need to, and really what it says is that we are all as humans designed to pursue happiness. And that follows from three different things. One of those things is that we like to increase our relatedness to other people, right? We like to strengthen our relationships. So if you look at MasterCard's Priceless campaign, this was something that, all of you have seen. It was about how, little moments, like you take your child out to a cricket game, it's his first cricket game. So you paid whatever you paid, a few hundred rupees for your tickets. and then you bought certain things there. Maybe you had a samosa there and so on. But it's that whole thing. It's not what the money that you spent in doing all of those things using MasterCard, but the special moment that you ended up having with your family or your son or something. And that is kind of the way that the priceless ads were done. And that is what was called priceless. So that's a key element that gets us off there, which is where we can strengthen our relationships. There are other ways in which you can do resolve, which is through enhancing your own competences and also through increasing your freedom to do certain things. So there are 3 different ways to do resolve, which I discuss in the book, but I'll stop there for a second to get some thoughts from Harish also.
Yeah. So, Sandeep, what I liked about this part of the third part of your equation between brand vibes and brand sense and brand resolve, what I like about the brand resolve part is a brand has to take care that it is moving consumers up the happiness ladder. Consumers are seeking happiness with any brand that you buy. It could be a brand of tea, it could be a brand of cars, it could be a brand of SUVs, a brand of air conditioners or jewelry. So how are you depicting, how are you making sure that consumers move up the happiness ladder? And how is that delivered to consumers? And the point you also make is people don't always stay 10 on 10 on happiness. You reach the 10 on 10 point in a transient manner, and then you drop off to 6 or 7 again, or maybe 5 or 4 again, and then you're constantly seeking to get back to the 10 on 10 point, which only happens at some points, like your example of eating Ben & Jerry's ice cream. It's when the ice cream is dripping in your mouth that you're at 10 on 10. When you complete eating it, you probably then decay to 7 or 8.
Yes.
And the thought I have here is, I was reflecting when I read about this. Let's take Tata Motors, which produces some beautiful SUVs and cars. The Tata Harrier, which is a SUV, or Tata Nexon, which is their best-selling SUV at the moment. Now, if you look at a Tata Harrier advertisement, or you look at Tata Harrier communication, they will tell you about what a wonderful off-road experience it can give you over a weekend, and how you can use it to get away with your family over the weekend. Mm-hmm. Now, that they do that because that is also the happiness that consumers are seeking. The long drive outside your city along with your family takes you into that level of happiness, which is much more than where you're today. It's something that you aspire perhaps to do every weekend or every second weekend. And therefore, I think it works very well, because it is showing happiness point A to happiness point B, which is higher. And it is showing your product or brand as integral to driving that happiness, which is also important. Like you mentioned in your book, your product or brand has to take the consumer from point A to point B of happiness. So I love the principle that you said. How can your brand get consumers to perceive that the brand is going to make you happier, and that the brand is an integral part of the journey of making you happier? So those are 2 comments I want to make, Sandeep. And I also want to say before I leave the discussion that it is such a wonderful book that you have written, and these 3, the framework of using the brand vibes and brand sense and brand resolve is a beautiful, simple framework, which I think many of us who are marketers can view our brands through that lens. So thank you for a very, very well written book. I enjoyed reading it. And if if Anil were to hold up the book again, I would encourage everyone on this discussion. You should be reading, if you're a marketer or if you have aspirations of being a marketer, you should be reading this book. It's got so many brilliant examples. I also like the fact that many of your examples are from the pharma industry, which is really a very challenging industry to market to consumers, given that you take pharmaceuticals only when you're unwell. I love that, and I think I'd like to commend you on your work. But thank you very much for inviting me, and please accept my congratulations on a wonderful book that you've written.
Well, thank you, Harish, for joining this conversation. It's very clear that you've read the book very thoroughly, and it's wonderful for me to hear you articulate some of the ideas in the book and complement them with all the articles, with all the experiences that you've had with the Tata Group. That was fascinating. I was sitting here and taking notes throughout the time that you were talking.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandeep. Please do continue with your discussion with Anil. And if you permit me, I'd like to drop off this call to get into something else.
Many thanks, Harish.
Thank you, Harish. Thank you, Harish.
Thank you.
So Sandeep, please continue. Sorry to interrupt, but I think there was some little bit of coordination issue. Please carry on. My apologies.
And you know, we can certainly take questions from the audience as well. But I think those ideas that, and I think Harish did a wonderful job of synthesizing some of the key ideas, which are kind of complicated ideas, but he did a great job of synthesizing some of those ideas in what he was talking about. But this whole notion of increasing happiness is a very important one, and there's a lot of research that is being done by psychologists around this topic of, you know, what makes people happy and so on. But it is accepted that all humans are wired. It's just in your DNA that you are going to pursue happiness. You will get to the permanent, you will get to a score of, you know, if you're 1 to 10, if you're talking about, you'll get to a score of 10 on happiness, but it ultimately declines. And so really what you have to do as a brand is you have to convey to people, how will buying your specific product, you know, make people happy? And as you saw in that MasterCard example, it's not that they just show the different emotional stories and what have you, and then say, hey, you know what, MasterCard, having MasterCard or paying with the MasterCard is priceless. It really, what they're showing is that their brand, when Harish was talking about this notion of getting from point A to point B, the point A to point B in the MasterCard brand is that you are using MasterCard for buying each of the things which ultimately make your family so happy, right? So that connection, making your brand the key to other people's happiness, increasing their happiness is the main thing. There are two researchers in particular in the University of Rochester. Their name is, Desi and Ryan. And what they showed is that the things that make you really happy, they said that there's actually only 3 universal keys to increasing happiness, only 3. And one of those keys is around, giving you autonomy, which means helping you be free. And, giving you the sense that you are in control of things. So that is, if your brand can sort of work to help people feel that they're in control, then that is one way to drive happiness. The other way to drive happiness, the second way to drive happiness, is by helping you think that the brand that you're going to use is going to enhance your own skills. It's going to enhance your own happiness. It's going to enhance your sense of self, but really advance you on that scale of your self-competence. And the third one, as we talked about, was the MasterCard example, which is the relatedness to others. So these 3 things, which is autonomy, self, and connections, those are the 3 ways in which you drive results. I can certainly show you more examples, or I can take questions, whichever way you'd like to do this.
What we'll do, Sandeep, that first I will, before I reflect on what you have just said, I will request Anu to activate the Q&A and the chat box so that people can type in their questions. And while they are doing that, let me reflect on 2 things. One thing is the, changing of habits. So it reminds me of a wonderful example, and with your permission, I'm sharing it with you. The QWERTY keyboard. It has been in existence since 1870, and it was invented when there were manual typewriters. And with the advent of technology, I'm sure it is not the best layout, but an attempt was also made in 1932, but it did happen, and still we are continuing with the QWERTY keyboard. That was one thing. And you also mentioned about we compare, and we always make a statement related to something. And in your book, there is a wonderful example. So no matter how well you are doing, but your salary has to be higher than your wife's sister's husband. This is from your book, and what a wonderful example it is. So while the questions are coming in, I would like you to address 2 wonderful examples from your book, and both the brands are doing well in India. One is both are from the food industry. One is the Oreo cookies, and you have mentioned that the market share went up from 1 to 30%. That is one example. Then the second example is Act 2 popcorns. They are also very popular in India. So please run us through these 2 examples, and then we'll take questions, and then we'll come to the last part. Please
Okay,
continue.
okay. Yeah, so what you have done, both of those examples have heavy connections to the whole thinking around system one. The notion, if you remember, at the end of the day, the other way you can think about this is that everything is happening in our brains. But what does that mean? It means that everything about brands is ultimately biology, right? Which is why it is so difficult to change our habits, because what happens is that as we have learnings in life, those actually change the cellular fabric that exists in our brain. The neuronal network that exists in our brain actually gets changed. And that's why we're all stubborn. That's why we have habits, that because our biology actually has to change before we can change our minds. So that is why people use System 1, because as a brand marketer, you realize that for the person to really fundamentally change their cellular fabric in their brain is going to be very difficult. So why not go with something that they already believe in or like in? So when you talk about Act 2 was a situation where originally their whole success, which Act 2 is a popcorn brand, for those of you that don't know it, but it's very popular in India. But they noticed that, everybody goes to movies, and then when they go to movies, they always have popcorn, particularly in the West, and there's butter in it and so on. So this whole thing was a very pleasurable experience that was very integrally linked. The idea of consuming popcorn was linked very integrally to having fun at the movies and being with your family. So when they first introduced Act 2, and look at the name, Act 2, it is a theater act, right? And it was completely based on the movie theater experience. So you take the popcorn, you put it in the microwave, it comes out, and you can make a Friday movie fun for the whole family. And that is what started off that brand, and it made it #1 here in the US. It's #1 in Mexico. It's #1 in India, and so on. So by making things relate to some experiences that you already had, anchoring them to them is called the anchoring bias. You can always make your brand easier to accept. So that's that example. On the Oreo cookie example that you mentioned, was where we were talking about changing people's behavior. And what happens is that in US, the campaign that has been very successful for Oreo cookies is that you take an Oreo cookie and then you dunk it in your milk, and then you kind of split it open. Well, actually, you split it open, you dunk it in your milk, and then lick it and then eat it. And that's kind of a very strange way to consume an Oreo cookie that is a cookie that is like that. But what they had to do was, when they were going to India and introducing Oreo cookie in India and in Pakistan and all these places, they had to think about, well, how do we convince people to do this? And they did a number of very clever ads and campaigns to actually do that over and over again through repetition to change people's mind. But it took a long time to make that happen. And that's one of the things, that when you have to change people's wiring, then you have to repeat some of these things over and over again in their context to make them actually change their behavior. So they did it, but it took them some time. And once they did it, it worked very well.
So I just want to reflect on what you said on the Oreo cookies example. See, I'm not surprised that the brand has garnered a 30% share. If you go back, I think you will remember that we have been used to dunking biscuits in the cup of tea. You remember
Yes.
Parle G. But what was new about this fact was, these were cream-filled cookies. So
Yes.
that was something new. We never used to dunk cream-filled cookies. So that is the new. But I think Indian audience and consumers adapted it very well. So now there are a lot of questions are coming in. So what we will do is we'll finish the sensitive part, the philosophical part, and then we will take questions, and then we'll invite Ashok Meena. So coming to the last part, see today, given the COVID situation, COVID-19 has devastated mankind. So many millions of people have lost their jobs, their livelihood, people have lost their lives. Yet, what you find is the luxury sector is booming. And as a result, Bernard Arnault has become #1. He is the richest man in the world. So I read a wonderful research, which was actually conducted by Ernest Becker, the Pulitzer-winning writer who's passed away. And then there is a gentleman, Professor Sheldon Solomon, and they carry forward the same theme, that when human beings are faced with existential crisis, there is something called mortality reminder. So according to this theory, and I believe in that theory because we cannot go much into the depth of it, but the fact is that behind every human action, there is a mortality reminder. Whether we like it or not, we are always reminded that, oh, today is a wonderful day, I am alive. But on the other hand, we also are afraid we may die anytime soon. So that changes behavior in many respects. People are finding meaning, purpose, and happiness in life, especially during these times. And in fact, it also creates a fear factor. And you have really shared a beautiful example, the Trump example in loss aversion bias. So what is happening today is there are two schools of thought, and there are random acts of kindness all over the world. People are contributing generously to totally random strangers. So there are two things which are happening today, is that either we are polarizing people and they're becoming more adamant and more radicalized, and on the other hand, they are finding a purpose in life, because everybody wants to be immortal. They believe that there is a afterlife, and what is the concept of hell and heaven? It all exists in the mind. And what is a birthday? We celebrate birthday, but it is the reverse countdown. What is it? It is a quality reminder. So given this scenario, what can brands do? How do they tell the stories to relate to the consumer sentiment and also do good? So I think this is what I would like you to address, and then we will take questions. Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mortality reminder has been particularly stark in the last 1 year. I think, and brands have to react to that because something has changed. And let me tell you what this mortality reminder is. This is just my opinion. This may or may not have anything to do with branding, but nonetheless, I think what has happened is that when the pandemic first started in 2020 in March, the one thing that was very true about the pandemic was that there was no cure. This was something that was spreading very quickly, and we didn't know exactly how quickly, but it was spreading very quickly. And until the vaccines came about in December, there was no cure. It didn't matter how much money you have. It didn't matter if you were living in the United States and you have access to the best healthcare and so forth. It didn't matter. None of those things mattered because there was no cure. So in that sense, all of us were reminded about our mortality. And a lot of us took a look at, hey, have we written a will? And what are we doing? Have we got our affairs in order? Because this could happen anytime. So I think in the last 1 year, those things became much more real. In the West, the reaction that many people had as a result of that extreme reminder about mortality was that, hey, since I cannot take life for granted, what is it that I want to do in life? What do I want to do with my life? And for some of the more richer people, if you will, the luxury market, it can go either way. Some people said, okay, you know what? Maybe I should, I've accumulated all this money. Maybe I should spend it, because life could end anytime. And so you see that post-pandemic, there's been a bump in the luxury market as people said that, look, just making money and putting more and more of it away in a back room or in a bank is not really helping me live a better life. I need to do something with it. So I'm going to go out and enjoy it. And I'm going to take this money and I'm going to spend it on my kids, on my families, or whatever that motivates them. And that took the luxury market up. But for other people, I mean, there's been all kinds of philosophical reflection about what to do. And for us, particularly for me in writing this book, I was glad that I wrote this book because this was knowledge that historically, we didn't really share with anybody. It was proprietary to our company. We used to sell it to our clients. We used to make money on it. And we didn't feel like we wanted to share it with other people and get rid of our competitive advantage. But I think the whole mortality thing also affected us in terms of saying that, what good is a certain amount of knowledge? What good is that knowledge that is mortal, right? Knowledge, we as people are meant to be mortal, but knowledge is not intended to be mortal. So I think that was a big factor from a philosophical perspective that led me personally to write this book and share things which historically for the last 15 years have been proprietary to my company.
Great. So there is a lady by the name of Judith, and her question to you is, would you please repeat the names of the researchers who wrote about 3 roads to happiness?
Oh, that's Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. They're at the University of Rochester. And yeah, there's a lot of research that they have, which is on happiness. And I would certainly look at that. There's also a wonderful course around happiness, which is available, I think, on YouTube, taught by one of the Yale professors called Laura something. I'll have to remember the name, but yes, it's on YouTube. You should watch that, as well as a lecture on happiness by Paul Bloom, also of Yale, a psychologist at Yale, and those are very, very entertaining. Watch the lecture on by Paul Bloom. That's just 1 hour. You know, it's very easy watch and very useful.
Great. Now, I hope, Judith, that satisfies you. The second question is from Rubal Rathi, and she wants to know whether your model is applicable to luxury brands, since the strategies are very different.
The model is applicable to all brands. This model is not about any specific brands, but this whole idea about making connections, as you saw with the examples from Tanishq, you saw the examples from De Beers and from Cartier and so on. You know, there's just all of these brands. The model actually works really well in the luxury brand space.
Then now there is a gentleman by the name of Anurag, and he wants to know, how should family jewelers position their brands when today Tanishq is positioned itself using system 1 and Malabar is now using system 2 to gain more market share?
Right. And that's a great question. And, you know, I wouldn't say that the family brands are not brands. I mean, they have their own charm and their own draw in certain ways. So like, you know, I grew up in Jaipur, and, you know, the Gem Palace there is a big brand. There is the Suranas that are the big brands there, you know, and so on. So those family brands have done very well over time, but nonetheless, the market has, the whole thing about branding is that there's always a space for, you know, multiple brands. You have to figure out how it is that you're striking that connection with those different consumers, but each brand has its own thing. And let me just say one thing about jewelry in terms of the vibe, right? In India, we have this expression which we use, which is actually, I find it difficult to translate it into English, but in Hindi, we, you know, often say "kya baat hai," right? We see something and we say, "Iski kya, you know, is cheez ki kya baat hai," you know, kuch ya kya, you know, kya andaz hai is cheez mein. You know, we use terms like that, and those are the terms that really speak to the idea of the brand soul, which is when you look at 2 or 3 different pieces of jewelry, you know, there are certain pieces that just catch your eye because there is something special about them. It's indescribable. It is difficult to say, but that is what it is. So I think one of the things that the jewelry brands can really focus on is really understanding what is so unique about their designs. You know, for example, you know, when you look at a Cartier versus when you look at a Bulgari, these are brands that have a very specific look and feel that is so characteristic of them that it brings a lot of things around it. So I do think that there is lots of room here for designers and marketers to grow their brands.
Deepak Vora, he wants to know, is advertising the only way to position and build your brand?
Well, I think, you know, advertising, of course, does help in terms of getting mind share and being in front of people. But these days, with the advent of the new social networks and so on, there are other ways which are becoming useful for people to tell their own stories through, you know, influencer marketing, through social media marketing, through viral marketing, and so on. So you have seen instances of startup companies, for example, in the United States, and I described Dollar Shave Club and a bunch of other companies in the book. But these books have have done, these brands have done an amazing job of either discovering some key insight that people wanted to talk about, or structuring a great story about themselves. Like Allbirds is a shoe brand that became really famous by just sort of having a great story around the origins of their shoes in things like, you know, the merino wool and so forth. So if you have those great stories, if you find ways to really tap into some deep angst, then what we're finding with the new interconnected world is that people talk about your brand, and if you're lucky, those things take off. Nonetheless, there aren't too many shortcuts in marketing, and marketing is an expensive thing.
Great. So there are 2-3 questions on sustainability. So I'm clubbing them and asking you on behalf of all the people who have posed that question. Sustainability is the end thing today, and it has direct correlation to finding purpose and meaning in life. And people want, especially the youngsters, to make this world a better place to live in. And as we are discussing, the lab-grown diamonds are really making, as a category, their presence felt all over the world, but more so in the US. But what we find today is there are very lot of controversies, you know, whether it is really sustainable or not. Plus, there are no brands, and it is being sold as a cheaper version to diamonds. So, what is your take on luxury? I mean, lab-grown diamonds vis-a-vis the sustainability and the pricing and the branding aspect?
Yeah, so, you know, I think that those are all great questions as far as lab-grown diamonds are concerned. Now, mind you, as I said before, that diamonds in nature are not particularly rare. So that whole marketing around making diamonds special, that is something that De Beers had done, right? Which is to bring to, you know, to make that association, the original association that, like you said, it became the symbol of your engagement and of your wedding. But they basically used this thought around the diamond being this indestructible you know, material that you would want to represent or pick up on the vibe of your wedding, or at the aspirations that you would have for your relationships with your wife or your husband, whereby these relationships are forever, right? So that whole notion of wrapping those ideas into the body of a diamond was something that De Beers did very well and made the diamond itself a brand. Now, you know, what is being done around something deep and you know, something deep and connected with lab-grown diamonds, I haven't necessarily seen something like that which could release the category. And the challenge is that, as Harish was talking about, and as is discussed in the book, that people always try to compare, you know, to assess the value of something in relation to something else, right? That is just a natural instinct. We are not very good at judging the value of something in an absolute sense without any comparators. So what comparators are put in place is a very big thing, right? So if you make the comparator the real diamond, that you are kind of trying to copy the real diamond, then you've already sort of set a comparator to which you will be benchmarked. You know, you may be benchmarked lower or higher, but then you have to sort of make that case because you made your comparator the diamond. And in this case, what is happening is, because lab-grown diamonds are artificial and they're not real, you've kind of set in mind a comparator that automatically says that you're a cheaper product relative to the real diamond. And cheaper can also imply worse, right? So then you've sort of put all these negative associations around lab-grown diamonds. So to break out of that whole thing, in my opinion, I mean, these guys need to go towards a different direction where they, you know, speak to the uniqueness of lab-grown diamonds as distinct from real diamonds, as well as maybe, you know, get into certain associations, you know, which moments of life, you know, De Beers got associated with a moment of life. You know, what is that moment of life? It doesn't have to be a wedding. It doesn't have to be an engagement. It could be many other things that it could be associated with, right? The moments of life. And I think if Harish was here, he would talk about the new campaign, which is triggered around moments of life, right? And also the other thing you might notice about the Tanishq is that a lot of the jewelry wasn't really the 22 and 24 karat jewelry, right? Which in many traditional households would not even qualify as jewelry, right? If you said to somebody, hey, in an Indian household that you're getting 14 karat jewelry, it's kind of like, you know what, that's not really jewelry. The gold standard is really the 22 karat jewelry and so on. So you have to figure out how could a brand like the Tanishq, you know, sort of do things like connect to these special moments, working women, these different types of occasions, and say, for those occasions, their brand is the right choice, right? And I think that is the kind of thing with lab-grown diamonds. You got to find what are those special moments, what are those unique designs that will be very specific to lab-grown diamonds that you can come up with, which are the cue or the marquee for those particular products.
Fantastic. I think you have summarized it very well, and you have given a very detailed answer. And I, for one, I am with you fully on the fact that you have to compare a new product with something. And if you're comparing yourself with a diamond, first round you have lost. While there is a lot of potential on growing the category, but you have lost the first round in the sense that every diamond is unique. It's not the same. Whereas when you manufacture a diamond in the laboratory, all diamonds are exactly the same. Now you have given the example of Patek Philippe. See, every watch is different because it is handcrafted. So there is a story around it. And secondly, and the most important factor is the intrinsic value of a diamond is very well established. It is rare, it is expensive. Whereas you cannot compare a lab grown with a real diamond because the cost of making a lab grown is going to decrease as we go along. It is already 30%. So point very well taken. And there is too much excitement on the category, but we have a long way to go. And I think people will see a value in creating a story and a brand out of this category. And with these thoughts, let me now invite Ashok Bhai Minawala. Ashok Bhai, aao, padharo.
Thank you, Anil, for curating a wonderful webinar, for selecting two wonderful dignitaries for this webinar. And I am extremely thankful to you for setting up this whole thing. The subject of discussion was very interesting, very relevant for all of us. This industry really needs to know a lot on the element of branding. We need to change ourselves from the element of trading to coming to the understanding of branding. And I think these are the platforms that really bring in a lot of knowledge. These are the kind of people who can really give you a lot of insight. Sandeep, I'm so happy you launched your book in India first. That is, I think, a very good thing you did. A couple of things that I kind of noted from your communication, that even today, understanding the consumer in the old-fashioned way is still the key even today. Your insight on brands is simply amazing. You've given some various examples of brands, their attributes, and why and how they made it, and why they are still continuing to sustain and continuing to be at the top even today. Good brand wise take an effort to develop, and brand positioning is not actually a cakewalk. Values build vibe. Very important statement that you made. The element of emotional branding is so essential to sell a product, and we have to ensure that the emotion doesn't take over the product. That the essence sells and the brands develop and sell. That is extremely important. The speed of thinking, the brand sense, and how it works and connects with people, you explained it so well. The The Guinness ad was simply amazing, made of more. The philosophy behind, so different, so unique. Patek Philippe, we all very well know, is a brand that has made itself probably one of the finest brands in this in the world. It creates only family heirlooms. The whole element of happiness, the whole element of feel, and the whole element of luxury, how they actually are connected, interconnected with one another, and how brands can really make a big difference in associating with the right messages, with the right connections. I'm also extremely thankful to Harish Bhat, who has given his time, the Tata Group thought process, the mindset on how they actually have built their businesses, their brands, and the amazing insights that he has provided in the various companies that he got associated with, and his experience over the past 30, 35 years. I noted many points what Harish had said, but among them, it is very important was a good message by a brand on social causes, really builds the brand image tremendously. I personally am part of a brand which is a family brand over 90 years old. And I know what it takes really to build a brand in India. We are all family brands, and we all need to start looking at our companies as brands and start building it as brands, whether we are in manufacturing, whether we are in wholesale, whether we are in the retail business. A brand can be built anywhere, in any of the verticals, in any of the sectors of the business. And my message to the entire industry is start doing the right thing, start keeping up to your promises, start delivering quality, start assuring people, and start keeping a set of discipline in your work. And I can assure you, we shall build good brands as information will spread around, as the message spreads around, the industry itself can start becoming more and more organized. A very big thank you to Harish Bhat, a very big thank you to Sandeep Dayal, and a very big thank you to Anil Prabhakar for a wonderful webinar. Big thanks from Mindspeak, from the GJC, and from Brand Talk. Thank you so much. All the listeners who joined us today, we shall be on the YouTube very soon, and where you shall get a chance to see it again and again and again. All the very best. Good night for those in India, and a very good day to you, Sandeep, in America.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. This was really enjoyable and good for me to be able to reconnect with my roots here in India. And so thank you for taking your evening to spend some time listening to this.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. Thank you very, very much.
So thank you, Sandeep and Ashok bhai, for the kind words, and your kind words of encouragement keep me going. And we will keep on doing such initiatives in future as well. Good night, Shabba Khair, Shubh Ratri.
All the best to everyone. Bye-bye. And good night.